Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today, Brian Stout and I talk about AIDS, Ryan White, and Chapter 2 of Stranger Things 2, Trick or Treat, Freak. Hey everyone, Vince here. Before we get into this episode, I just want to say that any financial support you can throw our way would be greatly appreciated. Because this podcast is based on a college course and its primary purpose is to be educational, I don't want to commercialize it. I feel strongly that knowledge and education should not be commercialized. However, I am more than happy to accept donations. Now, we're still going to make the podcast because we enjoy doing it, and we're always going to do it for free, so don't worry about that. But if you want to support us, you can click on the link in the show notes, and we'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. This week, we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 of Season 2, which is Trick or Treat, Freak. And we're going to be talking about AIDS and Ryan White. So a really cheerful episode this time. I'm joined once again by friend and fellow stranger, Brian Stout. Brian, you want to talk about yourself?
Oh, I always love to talk about myself over and over again. I'm just that kind of person. Brian Stout. I live not far from Hawkins in Bloomington, Indiana, actually. And I am, Vince mentioned, kind of a fellow horror film geek as well. And never miss an opportunity to get to nerd out on some pop culture that I really enjoy, especially from my formative years. And by day, I'm a learning consultant. By free time, I do some freelance writing and about films and music here in town with one of the papers that is around.
Awesome. So before we get into the episode, let's just do a little background contextual discussion. What do you know about AIDS? Let's start immediately.
I know about AIDS. Oh my gosh. Besides stranger danger and drugs, it was probably the third most talked about topic in the 1980s, I'd say. It's definitely one of those things that I think that people now can look back at and you know, it's another one of those horrifically handled situations on the Reagan front. You know, initially it was seen or viewed as like a quote unquote gay cancer. It was definitely seen as the gay plague. That was only affecting people who were gay. And, you know, it was only later that, you know, as people who weren't gay were starting to get it. You know, unfortunately, that is the point at which we decided to try to understand it better and fight it more so. And of course, now we're in a place where, you know, things are much better for people who are living with AIDS, and that's amazing, of course.
And I think by now everyone knows what AIDS is. AIDS is an acronym. It stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, and we've lived with it long enough that it's kind of permeated culture to the extent that everyone has a sense of what AIDS is. It's not something which is new or shocking the way it was back in the 80s. So, yeah, I mean, we first learned about it in the early 80s. In around 1981, this mysterious illness started showing up in parts of New York City and San Francisco amongst the gay communities there, and kind of took off from there. So that's how it developed the reputation of being the gay plague, that it was something which affected only gay people initially. How is it transmitted?
Blood or fluids that are typically exchanged during sex. So I don't know. I think those were things that also allowed people to distance themselves from it, because that sort of put the two categories as like gay people and drug addicts.
Yes, drug addicts is the
So I
other
think that,
issue.
and so, that those two groups being affected so severely by it, I think allowed a lot of people to sort of go, well, that's kind of their thing. It's not anything that I'm going to encounter because I'm straight and I don't shoot
Exactly.
drugs.
There was this real sense for a large part of the 80s that it was only quote unquote dirty people who got it. People who were bad, who were gay or were drug addicts.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something that was really interesting for the time in particular, which was the one time that Tammy Faye Baker had a person who had AIDS on their show, which was completely groundbreaking for the time. Like none of the Christian folks would touch that, somebody, and that touch figuratively, wouldn't touch anybody who had
Well, I think literally,
AIDS, probably
yeah.
literally as well. And yeah, it was a really groundbreaking moment for television. And I think that there's a million reasons to not like the Bakers and to, find them despicable. But I think that once in a while, it's everybody has, like a moment where they might have, everybody's got their moment.
Everyone has the potential to be.
Yeah, it's a good, there you go. Perfectly. It's a good reminder of even the worst people's ability to potentially do something good once in a while. So she actually having had this person on, and she even said, "I wish I could hug you right now," which I'm sure probably made everybody in that audience clutch their pearls, because the person was also gay.
Yeah, and especially
so
among the so-called moral majority at the time, it was perceived as God's wrath or God's judgment against these bad people. Yeah.
There's not a lot of history there, so that was a surprising development.
So rather notoriously, the Reagan administration not only would not provide funding for research into AIDS, they kind of went in the opposite direction and cut funding for AIDS research.
Yeah, it's appalling. There's a lot of good. I mean, if this is a topic that interests you, there are several really interesting films about this. One of the most important ones, I'd say, is a documentary called How to Survive a Plague. It's really powerful. Another one that is maybe somewhat fictionalized but based on a true story is that Dallas Buyers Club, which came out probably 7 or 8 years ago. It's got Matthew McConaughey in it.
Right.
It's part of the McConaissance. So it's a very good film. It's very powerful. There's some great stuff in it. If that part of this interests you a lot.
Before we go to Ryan White, I want to talk a little bit about Rock Hudson. Do you remember Rock Hudson?
I certainly do. Famous movie star. Definitely a ladies' man, or at least we thought. That's a good point.
At least we thought, even though apparently within Hollywood it was fairly well known that he was gay.
Exactly. Yeah.
But for mainstream America, no, not so much.
Right. But we never knew anyone was gay. Most of very few. Like it wasn't not an environment that was welcoming to people being out. It was a time where coming out could make things very difficult for somebody. And so Rock Hudson passing, who was this, iconic film star, that was definitely the first famous person that we knew who died from AIDS. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And then of course, I mean, a few years later, we started to learn more and more that other people had it. I think currently, one of the great, I guess, survival story, for lack of a nicer term, is Magic Johnson.
Yes.
He's still doing fantastic and, seems to be living with AIDS very well. And, but that also was a major development when he mentioned that he had it.
Exactly. When Magic Johnson, when it was revealed that, or he revealed that he had AIDS, he was one of the few celebrities who was straight or known to be straight who had it, and that opened up so much more discussion that it's not just, hey, gay people who get this or drug addicts who get this. Arthur Ashe was another example of another athlete,
right? And he got it from a transfusion, if I remember correctly.
I think that's correct. Yeah. But yeah, going back to Rock Hudson, he was probably the first celebrity to not only reveal that he had AIDS, but to die of it not long after it was made public. And he was a friend of the Reagans. This is how much the Reagans were sort of opposed to even thinking about AIDS. Not only did Ronald Reagan never publicly use the word AIDS until I think 1987, but Rock Hudson went to Nancy Reagan to ask for help in getting treatment for AIDS patients, and she flat out refused him.
She just said no.
Yeah, just said no. And for those of you listeners who aren't aware, Just Say No was Nancy Reagan's anti-drug campaign. So yeah, nice,
highly
joke
effective.
There. I like the pun. Yeah,
highly effective. Look it up.
Yes,
just kidding.
Very much so. Yeah.
No one did drugs in the 80s. No, thank you.
So the Rock Hudson situation was the first time I think Americans really considered how serious the disease actually was, that if someone like Rock Hudson could get it. And that was something that made it, I don't know if I want to say it made it okay to discuss openly, but it was something that prompted open discussions about AIDS and AIDS research.
Yeah.
And then we come to Ryan White. So what do you remember about him?
He was a child who had it. And had gotten it through a blood transfusion, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he was a hemophiliac. And at the time, blood that had been banked for transfusions wasn't really being screened for AIDS, partly because there was a lot of public denial that this is something that actually existed, egged on by the Reagan administration. And then, he got the disease through a blood transfusion.
But his story became something that really, I think the idea, that there is a child who got this through simply trying to maintain his own personal health, became something that started to change some hearts a little bit. Yes. And
he did become an advocate for AIDS education. And he contracted AIDS in December of 1984. So it's very timely for what we're talking about in terms of Stranger Things. But then what was his experience?
Well, he was banned from school. I know one of the biggest fights I remember seeing in the news was trying to allow him to get back into school and pursue his education.
And do you remember where the school was, where he was from?
He's from Indiana, right?
He was from Indiana. Kokomo, Indiana.
A couple hours north of where I am here near Hawkins.
Yeah. But, he was banned from going to school once it became public knowledge that he had AIDS. So many other people in his community were so terrified of him infecting their kids. There was so little information and knowledge out there about AIDS and how AIDS spread.
It's very interesting, though, when you think about it, how the tide shifted so quickly, at least in terms of like the fear element, because initially, like you said earlier, people were just like, oh, that's just for gay people and drug addicts. And then once someone got it who was neither, then it became, oh my goodness, how he breathes on me, I could get it. Yeah,
exactly. And so many people at the time said, they were really sympathetic to him because he got it, quote unquote, in the right way. He wasn't gay.
What a horrible thing to say.
He wasn't gay. He wasn't a drug addict. Still, they were sympathetic to him, but they didn't want to be anywhere near him. And they didn't want him near their kids. And it got really ugly.
It sure did.
When we look at these topics from the 1980s, I'm usually able to look at them really objectively and look at, okay, here's the cause and effect, and here's what happened. This is one of the things that really pisses me off about the 1980s, is the way that Ryan White was treated. He was such a pariah, and people hated him, absolutely hated him for being sick. I mean, his house got shot up. People were trying to kill him because he dared to try to make their kids sick. And goddamn, that pisses me off.
It's appalling. I mean, of course, there's a degree of hindsight that we now have, but we also know that that was from like a major not a disinformation campaign, but a suppression of information campaign and straight up laziness.
Yes.
Like, why are we not trying to why are we not trying to understand this? It's amazing. The difference that a few years makes is really astonishing, because if you're, a child of the 90s listening to this, you probably grew up knowing that we spent so much money on AIDS research.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really only rivaled cancer. And, and we've been able to make some really incredible strides. But, it's just even a few years before that, there was a time when we didn't care about this,
Mm-hmm.
and if somebody got it through some means that, like you said, the quote unquote okay ways to have that happen,
Uh-huh.
it's it's a really appalling state of affairs. And
Yes.
you can't even, I don't know, just to imagine what his parents must have been going through it's bad enough to have a child that is, I can't even imagine my kids being terminally ill. To deal with somebody screaming at you on top of all that is
Exactly. It's
just
heartbreaking.
appalling. Yeah.
So how does that connect to Stranger Things? And I think we've already seen a couple connections. There's the Indiana setting.
Mm-hmm.
There's the time frame as well. He became infected in December of 1984. We're starting season 2, which is the very end of October. It's Halloween of 1984.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much of that time period.
Yeah.
How else does it connect?
Well, he was around the same age as them.
Yes.
Right? Wasn't he? I'm trying to remember how old he was when he died. I feel like 11.
No, he was older. He died shortly before he would have graduated from high school. But when he was infected, he was about 12 or 13 years old.
Okay, that might be. Yeah, there you go. That makes sense. Yeah. So we have quite a lot of connection here. And then of course, it's clearly not the same thing, but our heroes here are occasionally seen as pariahs from time to time, or
especially Will.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not quite as horrific as the way Ryan White was actually treated. The kids at school call Will Zombie Boy, right? Mm-hmm. And they mock him, tease him, and bully him for it, which for me reminds me so much of what happened with Ryan White.
Yeah, I think clearly you're meant to be thinking about those things if you have the knowledge of the era. So it's very much on brand with what the Duffer Brothers are usually up to. Just and this one happened to be literally in the backyard. So
yeah, I think there's a very deliberate connection that they are drawing between the character of Will and what actually happened historically with Ryan White and what was going on with AIDS. So chapter 2, Trick or Treat Freak. The freak in question is a reference to Will. So some older kids do bully him by calling him a freak and saying trick or treat freak and trying to scare him. Before we get into this episode, I do want to give a listener shout out to, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Charisse Booker. They sent an email about the episode we covered on Mad Max, and specifically looking at the role of the game of Dragon's Lair in that episode. And we had talked about how Dragon's Lair, that story of the Princess Daphne being abducted by the dragon, taken to the dragon's lair, and then the hero, the knight Dirk, has to go and save her, and how that reflects the story of Will being abducted by the Demogorgon and taken into the Upside Down. Charisse mentions that it also seems to be foreshadowing what's going on with Lucas and Dustin in relation to Max and the sort of romantic triangle there. Princess Daphne represents Max. And I thought, you know what? That is so brilliant. I'm kind of kicking myself for missing that, because that seems so obvious to me now. Yes, absolutely. Dragon's Lair does set up the relationship between Dustin, Lucas, and Max in this season. And in fact, there's the point where, Dustin is complaining about this overpriced bullshit in this game, and Lucas is kind of mocking him, saying, well, until you get better, Princess Daphne's all mine.
That is so good.
Yes,
wow,
absolutely.
I love it.
Good job on that and on catching that. And like I said, I'm kind of kicking myself for not seeing it. Yes, that's absolutely what's going on there.
Oh, right on. That's awesome.
Okay, so let's get into this episode. Trick or Treat Freak. What do you think of this episode? What are your thoughts about it?
When it started, I was kind of like, man, this is like one of the duller ones, but then it started to really kick into gear. There's some big stuff that happens. I mean, I feel like I say that almost every time, like, oh, it starts slow and then something cool happens. But I mean, there's a lot of good stuff here. Like the things with Nancy and Steve are very interesting, and kind of Nancy's reaction to everything that's going on in that night. There's some really fun references to pop culture all sprinkled in here. And 1984, of course, is like a really sweet spot year for me. Probably everybody who's like my age who was
and just pop culture in general. It was a big year for pop culture.
It was monstrous. There's so much great stuff that came out that year. Obviously, we get, first and foremost is the Ghostbusters, hence their outfits. And
yes, Ghostbusters. And we talked about this on the last episode, our Ghostbusters episode. Yeah, Ghostbusters came out in June of 1984. It was huge that year, especially going into Halloween.
Yeah, I would venture to guess it was probably still in theaters.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Or at least if it wasn't still in theaters, it was re-released into theaters for Halloween. I'm sure it was.
It's really hard to overstate like what a major phenomenon that movie was.
How do we see that connect to our show? I mean, obviously they're dressing as Ghostbusters.
Yeah, so it's no shock that our geeky gang here is into the Ghostbusters.
Yes,
it provides like one of the biggest laughs I think in this episode when they, there's some good humor in that sequence when they show up with their costumes on.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a little bit of back and forth about, why do you think I need to be Winston? And
and I do want to talk about that.
Yeah,
because this is one of the first times when the show explicitly deals with race. We've seen discussions, or the show has prompted discussions about class issues and about, sexism, but this is the first time that race gets touched upon.
Well, there seems to have been an unspoken expectation that Lucas would be the Winston character for Halloween. And when
because he's black.
Because he's black, and because Winston is black.
Yes.
And then, so he is not Winston.
He's not. He wants to be
a little rift.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want to be Bill Murray? Obviously, he's the best choice. It's clearly.
And we talked about this in the last episode of how Bill Murray's character, Peter Venkman, was the most popular character at the time and was kind of perceived as the hero of the movie.
Yeah. Well, he gets more to do. He's the one that gets the love interest. So that's usually how
he gets the girl, right?
In Hollywood screenwriting terms, he's the main guy, even that, he's first among,
he's the leader of the group. Yeah.
And he is seen as the leader most of the time, even though the others have got their thing that they bring into it. In real life, I think Aykroyd is the one who probably knows more about paranormal stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a huge interest of his.
Absolutely. And they do say in the show, I don't want to be Winston, because he's not even a scientist. He comes in super late in the movie. He's not as cool as Venkman is.
Yeah.
So what role does race play in Stranger Things?
Well, it starts to come out. As you mentioned, this is really one of the first times that it is explicitly dealt with in the show.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But then it continues to kind of unfurl a little bit as the show progresses. And, there are some instances where Lucas is put in some difficult situations.
Yes.
Other people.
And first of all, I think it's important to point out that there are very few black characters in the show.
Yeah, I was going to say that's.
Which I think is probably reflective of the place, small town, Midwest, Indiana. Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, certainly. There weren't very many black kids in my neighborhood.
Yeah, I grew up in Flint, and there weren't any black families in my neighborhood, but I went to school with a very diverse population. I don't know. I feel like that was a really good experience.
I think so.
But it was odd but it was weird. The city is super divided, and as to my knowledge, is probably still, the Flint River essentially bisects the city. And, and when I was growing up, especially in the 1980s, the conventional wisdom was that the black people lived north of the river and the white people lived south of the river.
Yep. And just so our listeners know, I'm from Flint as well. I was born there. And my family moved to Burton when I was really young. Burton is a city, but it is really a kind of a suburb of Flint. And then when I was around 9 years old, my family moved back to the city. And so when I was going to school in Burton, yeah, I had very little contact with anyone who wasn't white, right?
Yeah.
But once I returned to the city and started going to Flint schools, that was my first real exposure to people of color or other kids of color. And so there was a bit of a culture shock there for me.
And it was also true for the students of color. Like very few of them lived around people who were not like them. Like the city
Right.
was just very much in its own segregated
Yes.
little pockets. And so,
Exactly.
I
And
mean,
as you mentioned, the people of color, African Americans, were primarily known to live in the northern part of the city. My family lived on the east side, which was very blue collar, working class, white.
I was on the south side, which is similar demographic profile.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as far as my recollection of that time, a lot of it was, a lot of it was us kind of learning about each other basically by being together in these spaces. And as you alluded to, I'm super thankful for a lot of the cool things that happened because of that exposure
Yes.
to people who weren't just like
Oh,
me.
yeah. And very much so, looking back on it now, I am very thankful for having that exposure.
Yeah. The more people I am around who didn't have that kind of an upbringing, it makes me very thankful for being able to have had that.
So, yeah, in the show, we have Lucas, his family, the Sinclairs, which we don't really see much of them. We see more of his sister Erica, and she becomes a more prominent character as the show goes on. We do see his parents a couple times, but what other African American or Black or people of color characters do we see?
I can't even think of it.
I think the most prominent is Officer Powell, but also the principal of the middle school is a Black man, and we don't see too much of him. When we do see adult characters of color, they do tend to be in more authoritative positions. So Officer Powell, for example, the principal of the middle school, there is, and I wish I could think of the character's name, the farmer who comes to Hopper in this particular episode is a person of color. And then we get later on Kali and the member of her group, whose name I'm totally blanking out at the moment, who are characters of color. But that's really it. It's a very much a white cast.
Yeah. I mean, based on my experience driving around through the state, it's not that different still. Once you get away from areas like where I live or too far out of Indianapolis, it's definitely not very diverse.
Yeah. And I think it's also reflective of the movies and TV shows of the 1980s. There weren't very many shows that dealt with characters of color.
We were about to get one, probably the most important one ever,
which is
Cosby Show.
Yes.
I know it's not fun to talk about these days, but it was a massive, I mean, what we know about Bill Cosby, I don't want to say aside because that sounds super insensitive, but like to think about what that show did, it was a very groundbreaking show. It's about, when did that premiere? Was that 1980? That was right around this time. Was it 84?
I want to say it was 84. I'm not positive. You might want to look that up, but I feel like it was 1984. So yeah, The Cosby Show was a family sitcom about a Black family in, I want to say Philadelphia, although I'm not positive, but they were a upper middle class professional family. And so the idea of The Cosby Show was to show America just what life was like for people of color of that demographic and sort of acclimates mainstream America to positive depictions of African American characters and people.
It did premiere in 1984, by the way. I just looked.
That's what I thought. So yeah, what we're seeing in Stranger Things is really indicative of what people were familiar with at the time and what they saw. So I think it makes sense. But yeah, we do start to see negativity directed and racism directed towards Lucas' character, especially as he becomes more romantically involved with Max. And so we do start to see the part of the character of Billy, some of that ugliness happening.
Yeah, Billy gives the general group a thumbs down.
Yes.
In this episode.
Yes, but especially that one kid.
Yeah, right.
What else about this episode strikes you or jumps out at you?
Well, there's some fun needle drops. One that jumped out at me that was kind of interesting was that Jonathan enters the party to Girls on Film from Duran Duran.
Okay, so yeah,
not an accident.
Oh, okay, I get it now. I was wondering, you're looking at all of the songs used in this episode. That's the one that kind of stuck out to me as it didn't really fit in. But now that you mention it, of course, Girls on Film, in the previous season, he got in trouble for taking some pictures of girls without their knowledge. Duh. Okay, that makes so much sense now.
Oh, I laughed out loud.
That's good. Yeah. I wish I got that before, because now that you mention it, that is brilliant. I
laughed out loud. Of course, for a Halloween party in 1984, you can't do that without Shout at the Devil, obviously.
Yeah, Shout at the Devil.
Crew was
Motley
Crue, right in their heyday. That was a time when they were very much feared.
And this was kind of early in their career. Shout at the Devil was their second album, but it was also probably the most notorious for being playing into or playing on the Satanic Panic. And I remember my older brother had that album on tape, and I listened to it a lot, partly because I genuinely liked the music, but also because I kind of got a thrill out of listening to something that was clearly meant to be so evil and so bad. I remember reading the liner notes to the album saying that this album may contain backward messages. I thought, oh, wow, that's really cool. Obviously, it didn't, but they were playing on that whole Satanic Panic aspect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They played it up in the music videos that came out from that album as well. And
scandalous.
I mean, there's those flying pentagrams in the Looks That Kill video. And or was that Looks That Kill or Too Young to Fall in Love? I don't remember which. I feel like maybe Looks That Kill.
But yeah, you're right. The song Shout at the Devil is, of course, for this time period, you would hear that at a Halloween party. So that fits. That makes sense. Ghostbusters, of course, is played twice in this episode for obvious reasons.
Because it was played every 15 minutes for the entirety of 1984 from June to December.
Just about, yeah. We also get Wango Tango.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Ted Nugent.
Yeah, probably the less that's said about that, the better.
What's the context for that song?
Oh, God. I think it was Billy, right? Isn't he driving around listening to it?
It's when Billy is driving Max home from school and they're fighting. He's got that blasting on his tape deck in his car when he goes to act like he's going to run over our heroes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Wango Tango, Islands in the Stream, Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton.
Yeah. Not surprising that Bob's into that at all.
We learned in the previous episode that Bob loves Kenny Rogers, and Islands in the Stream was a current song for that time. So that makes sense. It reveals something about his character or connects with his character. And like I said, these other songs in this episode I thought made sense for this particular episode because we connect them to the characters or to what's happening. So Wango Tango, for example, we can totally expect Billy to be listening to that song and jamming to it. Islands in the Stream, we can expect Bob to be jamming to that song.
Yeah, that's a Bob seduction track for sure. It's on his playlist.
We get Monster Mash, of course, which makes sense. Halloween and Halloween party. And now that you mention it, Girls on Film, that's one, like I said, that did not make sense to me. But now it totally makes perfect sense. Yes.
I bet Jonathan would be mad because he probably doesn't like Duran Duran.
Probably not. But here's the thing. In that Halloween party, I made a list of various pop culture references that we see in that party, and I'm sure I missed several. But one of the more prominent ones is he meets a girl named Samantha who's dressed as Susie Sue, and he does not recognize her. What do you think about that?
It kind of bummed me out. I'm going to be honest with you.
Why is that?
I figured somebody who listens to Joy Division and likes the Evil Dead and is into and the Clash would be a Susie and the Banshees fan.
Yeah, you would think that that's
disappointing to
exactly
me.
what he would be listening to.
So I don't know if I need to blame the Duffer Brothers for not knowing their punk and new wave from the 70s as well as they should have. Or
So
whether
yeah,
I should say, Jonathan, what are you doing, you poser?
exactly. He comes off as a poser here.
Yeah.
So for those listeners who aren't familiar with Susie Sue and the Banshees, they were a 70s, 80s punk, post-punk, goth rock band. That is absolutely what Jonathan should have been listening to.
Yeah, it should 1,000,000% be on one of his mixtapes.
Yes.
Without a doubt. The idea that he doesn't like them is it's a pretty egregious miss.
Yes. Or not even doesn't like them, but doesn't recognize them.
Yeah. That was a surprise to me.
Yes.
I remember when I first watched the episode, I thought, oh, he's gonna get a girlfriend.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking too. Here's a girl who's totally into what he's into.
Yeah.
And he thinks she is dressed as a member of Kiss. Breaks my heart.
It has to be on purpose then, because
I think it would have to be
that low.
Yeah, so that seriously sort of puts a damper on his credibility as
major ding. Yep.
As an art kid. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that party,
he doesn't like The Cure, right?
Right. So in that party, we get references to Karate Kid. Did you catch that?
Yep, very 84.
Yep. So, and I'm just drawing a blank on so many characters' names right now, but Steve's former friend is dressed as one of the Cobra Kai guys from Karate Kid, who were the bad guys, by the way.
Yeah, despite what you now see.
Yes, Cobra Kai is now a very popular TV show, but at the time, Karate Kid was a new, very popular movie in which Cobra Kai were the villains. They were the bad guys.
Yeah. I actually really like the way the show sort of flipped the script on the movie and said, yeah, actually, Daniel was kind of a dick. It's kind of like the way we've rediscovered that Ferris Bueller is an asshole.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. At the time we never, in the 80s we didn't think that deeply about it. We just saw that as like another, like one of the better executed Rocky knockoffs. Right. So of course we were rooting for this dude, and who doesn't want someone to end up with Elizabeth Shue? I mean, come on.
That is true.
There's that.
She was a hottie. Yeah. I would argue she's still a hottie, but
I was going to say, I don't know if I would say was. I think I'd say is.
Yes. But yeah, in the 80s, she was everywhere.
Oh, for sure. She had a good run.
Yes.
And so, I think that was a fairly popular costume that year, if I remember correctly.
I don't remember specifically Cobra Kai being a popular costume, but certainly Daniel-san from the Karate Kid. Yeah, that would have been popular. We get a reference to Animal House. One of the partygoers is dressed as Bluto from Animal House, which was John Belushi's character. We get a Risky Business reference. Did you catch that? A lot of people overlook this.
Yeah, just tell me. I looked at. I saw that you had that, and I went.
Yeah, Steve and Nancy. Steve and Nancy are dressed as yes, that's their costumes. They're dressed as Rebecca De Mornay and Tom Cruise.
How did I miss that?
From Risky Business, yes. Which is a callback to the previous season when Steve says, "Hey, some people think I look like Tom Cruise," and of course Nancy is a big fan of Tom Cruise. There was a kid wearing a Reagan mask. And then there was
on brand for 80s Indiana, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And then there was a young woman dressed as Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman will come back later on in season 3 in a more overt way. So I don't think this is actually like foreshadowing, but I just thought it was interesting that we got a Wonder Woman reference there at the party.
What were the years on the Wonder Woman TV show with Linda Carter?
That was
been on?
It would not have been on. It was 70s. I know it ran for 5 seasons.
Oh, it ended in 1979.
Okay. So yeah, it was very much a 70s show.
Okay. So probably somebody's mom bought that costume for that person, and they were like, "Oh shoot, man!" But
I could be, but
I don't know.
still,
Wonder
Wonder
Woman's
Woman,
perennial.
especially Linda Carter, she was really hot. I think anyone
We're gonna
saw
lose
that would
some
like.
listeners if we keep going in this direction. We better reel it back in.
Well, Tom
Um,
Cruise was really hot too.
yeah, he was. He was very, very hot in the 80s.
Yes.
Definitely.
And then, of course, there are many other allusions that we see in this particular episode. But that's what I saw at the Halloween party. I don't know. Did you catch anything else there? So I'm sure
No,
there's
I
stuff I
actually,
missed.
no, I think you got even some ones that I didn't. So I'm gonna just defer to your expertise on.
What else about the episode stands out to you?
Well, there's that really interesting scene where Will starts to freak out a little bit
Yes.
when he's trick or treating, and that had some, it had some Halloween vibes from like the classic old film to me.
How so?
Um,
Because I agree there
just
are Halloween references here.
for, I
The
mean,
movie
with
Halloween.
those, yeah, with those wider shots of the kids just kind of chaotically mingling around the street, very much
Uh-huh.
reminded me of some scenes in the original Halloween. And then also some of those POV shots, which the other film is very, the first Halloween film is
Yes.
very famous for those POV shots.
Yes. There are some really cool shots in this particular episode. One that stands out to me is when Hopper realizes he's late getting back to 11 and starts to drive off. The way the camera is set up, we see the kids tail in the foreground, and then Hopper in the truck driving away, and then stops and reverses because he has to get some candy for 11. I love that particular shot. And that very much, now that you mention it, does remind me of a John Carpenter shot.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to mention that because it did have kind of had a Carpenter look. There's a lot of, I mean, he's all over the place in this show.
Yes, yes.
As he should be.
And there is an overt reference to Halloween and Michael Myers. Max is dressed as Michael Myers, which is, I think, a brilliant callback to the first season, because in the second episode of the first season, this is when the boys first really get introduced to 11. They find her in the woods, and then they take her to Mike's basement, and they're asking her all these questions. She's wearing the hospital gown, and I think it's Dustin who asks if she escaped from, or suggests that she escaped from a mental hospital like Michael Myers.
Ah, yeah.
So that was episode 2 of season 1. This is episode 2 of season 2, in which Max is introduced to the gang dressed as Michael Myers. I think that's a brilliant callback.
So what we're establishing is that any new women who are inducted into the series have to come in via a fake serial killer. So yeah, so much for the wokeness. Now, there's probably something interesting to unpack there. I'm just thinking about it though.
Oh, I'm sure there is. Here's one thing that I never noticed until I was just rewatching it last night. Hopper says to Joyce about Will, "Are you going to take him back to Chicago?" The implication being that she took him to Chicago to see a therapist. I never caught that detail before, but Chicago pops up a few times in this season. Murray is from Chicago. He was an investigative reporter for the Chicago newspaper. And when we follow 11, when she meets up with 8, Callie and her gang, it's in Chicago. So I don't know if that's foreshadowing or what the situation is. I never caught that detail before, that there's some story happening, some backstory with Will and Joyce and Chicago that I'm kind of interested about this now. There's something there. And then we do get a discussion. It's in that same scene between Joyce and Hopper about flashbacks. So the first episode of this season introduces the idea of PTSD, and we get a sense that Hopper is familiar with that. This furthers that a little bit more, because Joyce is showing Hopper the picture of the mind flare that Will has drawn, trying to get his opinion on it. And Hopper says, well, he's not having dreams, he's having flashbacks. Which is something he says that he's known a few guys who have gone through that
right, yeah,
themselves. And this episode is filled with flashbacks. We see 11 have a few flashbacks herself.
That's right. Yeah.
And then Nancy has flashbacks to Barb.
Mm-hmm.
So that idea of the flashback and trauma is prominent or very important to this particular season, and we get it referenced here.
And that leads to Nancy's big meltdown also, which and
everything's bullshit.
And a big reveal.
Yes.
That she doesn't love Steve. And
yes.
She mentions Jonathan when poor Steve is taking care of her.
Yes.
So tough week for Steve. But he looks like Tom Cruise, so
he does look like Tom Cruise. He can comfort himself with that. Yes.
Yes. I'm sure he'll make the right moves somewhere else.
Oh, dude.
Boom. Since he's been engaged in some risky business.
Geez. Okay. Moving on.
I hope he doesn't feel like too much of an outsider.
Dude, stop. Just stop.
That's all. Yeah, it was a tough week for Steve. It's interesting to see. I mean, I think it's interesting the way this show deals with what we would now call PTSD, because they don't have as we've mentioned in some other episodes, they don't have the language for it yet, but people were still experiencing it. Of course, everybody's dealing with the trauma of it in their own way, but yeah, flashbacks are certainly a hallmark of that, just of having that issue. So it's been interesting to see Hopper sort of lead the way on that conversation.
We get several symbols and motifs in this particular episode. So 11 dresses up as a ghost. What does that symbolize?
Well, she's kind of missing to people.
Yes, she kind of metaphorically is a ghost.
Yeah.
She is missing, but she's also like spying on people from the outside using her abilities. Also, I saw
that supernatural element.
Yes.
Of ghosts.
I also saw that as an ET reference.
Oh, yes, of course. That's the only way they could get him out there.
Yes, exactly. They dress him as a ghost with a sheet on Halloween.
Which is actually the argument that she makes to try to get to go.
Exactly. She wants to go out trick-or-treating.
I'm wearing
exactly.
The ghost costume. Yeah.
Exactly. So I thought that was nice. I like that. But yeah, and so initially when I first saw it, I just saw it as a reference to ET. But then looking at it more symbolically, I'm like, well, no, wait, she is really kind of a ghost in the story up to this point. She's looking at people. She's on the outside looking in.
And she sort of exists as a memory to the people around her because she's not part of their lives right now outside of Hopper. So
yes. Hopper tells her that he will be back home at 5:15, and she's not really cognizant of the idea of time and how to tell time. That's something which is new for her. So she thinks of it as 5:15. But 5:15 is, if you add up the numbers, 5 + 1 + 5 = 11. And we do get several instances of numerology in this particular episode, but also in this season as well. So 5:15 is 11. They talk on the CB radio on channel 11 using Morse code. Hopper's knock, and I'm not sure what to make of this, but when Hopper knocks on the cabin door to let her know that it's him, the code is 213. He knocks twice, then once, and then 3 times, which in Morse code is ITS, or ITS. And I have to think that means something, that's deliberate, but I don't know what, at least not yet. And then when Mike is on his walkie-talkie trying to talk to her or reaching out to her, he says that this is day 353, and 3 + 5 + 3 is 11. So a lot of 11s in the background here. And then several allusions. Like I said, there were several at the Halloween party, but we get other allusions referenced in the episode. So the Terminator, for example. So Terminator was referenced in the first episode because it's playing at the theater downtown. But when 11 is flipping through the channels on the TV, there is a promo for Terminator, and it talks about how he's an unstoppable machine. She lands on All My Children and starts imitating Susan Lucci as the character of Erica, repeating her lines. There's a reference to Chinatown when the farmer goes to the police station to complain about his neighbor destroying his pumpkins. The other officers, Callahan and Powell, are talking about how there's this conspiracy going on, just like our own little Chinatown. Mad Max is referred to. Did you catch that one? So Mad Max, of course, is referenced in the first episode. That is the name that Max puts into the arcade game
for the video game. Yeah.
But also when Billy almost runs over our guys on their bikes, I can't remember which character it is who looks up and says, "It's Mad Max," referencing Max, but also referencing the movie, because if you're familiar with the movie of Mad Max, that's the sort of thing that does happen in those movies. And the car, Billy's car, which I think is a Camaro, although I'm not positive, I'm going to have to go back and look at this, but it is very reminiscent of Mad Max's car. So there's the reference to Mad Max. There's a reference to Frankenstein, because Eleven does end up watching Frankenstein on the TV. And if you think about Frankenstein and the whole idea of the mad scientist making a monster, well, we see clear parallels to the first season of Stranger Things there. And then there's the Halloween references. Oh, and there's a reference to Viewmaster. When Will is trying to describe to Mike his visions and what they're like, he says it's like being stuck between two slides on a Viewmaster. Do they still make Viewmasters? I'm not sure how many people would get that reference.
I think that they do. This is based on my experience buying toys for small children. I feel like I have seen a Viewmaster at the store in recent years. For those of you who are not in the loop, a Viewmaster was a very coveted toy in the 1980s, which it's like a set of goggles, basically, and then you can put a little card into it. It's got little film images, and then there's a handle on the side. I don't know why I need to describe this. I'm sure you could just Google it. But anyway.
No, go ahead and describe this. I was going to ask you to describe it anyway.
Yeah. So you use the arm on the side of the Viewmaster. So you hold it up to your eyes like it's a set of glasses or goggles. Then you use the lever on the side of the toy to cycle through the images that are on the slide. It's almost like a portable slide projector in a sense.
Yes.
I mean, it totally is, actually. But
it is. But it also uses stereoscopic 3D imagery.
Yeah. You know, when they were super popular in the 80s, there were just oodles and oodles of different adventures that you could watch. Like, I'm quite sure I had a lot of superhero stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember
Muppets and Star Wars,
quite a few.
And all that. Yeah.
Yeah. So very popular pop culture story reels, essentially, because each slide would have subtitles, basically, or not each one, but they would often have subtitles which tell a story. So as you flip through the images, they would be 3D images, but they would also, taken together, would tell a particular story. And so I remember seeing many like Spider-Man adventures on Viewmaster and that sort of thing. And I really wish I still had a Viewmaster, because those things were really cool.
They were. But what I've found as a parent now is that things that I think will be fun and retro, my children have zero interest in. It's a hard to please crowd now. Those 2010ers.
Viewmaster, what's this? Give me an Oculus Rift or something in VR, man.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I understand.
This is a baby's toy.
Right. My children were thoroughly unimpressed when I explained an iPod to them. And I was like, no, you don't understand. This is literally, I thought we'd reached the pinnacle. I'm like, this is it. It's all downhill from here, right? I can put 20,000 songs in my pocket. It's over. We're done.
How awesome is that? Well, yeah, but you can't use it to make phone calls.
Yeah, well, my daughter said, you can't watch anything on it? That's all it does. I believe she said, that's all it does,
That's all it does, yeah.
I was like,
listen, you little brat. I mean, that's all we wanted back then. That's all we needed. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that not too long ago too, is that, iPods were so popular and yet they're so completely outdated now. It's astounding. But yeah, that's the way Viewmaster is now, I think, is we're moving towards VR and that sort of thing. Viewmasters are old technology, even though I still think they're really cool. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those episodes where it gains momentum as it goes, and some pretty big things happen right toward the end of it. Of course, Steve is dejected, and you kind of wonder what's going to happen with Nancy and Jonathan at this point. And
I mean,
and then,
structurally, in terms of the story, this is still part of the exposition for this particular season. So it's just establishing themes and relationships and conflict. So where does it go from here?
That's for next time.
That's for next time. Actually, for next time, we're going to Stephen King. We're going to talk about Stephen King's The Mist, specifically the novella. So your homework is to read The Mist. Anything to add or anything that you want to talk about or promote before we sign off here?
No, I don't really have anything cooking just this minute as far as new material out there in the world.
Where can people find you online?
Well, I have some articles on the Rider magazine, which is based out of Bloomington, but it is online also. I also had an article on Pop Matters recently about one of my favorite records from the 1990s, The Promise Rings Nothing Feels Good. And then also I have a handful of pieces up on a website called wordsandmusic.club, which is just me and a bunch of friends of mine taking a theme and a song and tying those things together. There's a lot of really good, talented people writing for that site. I'm definitely happy to be associated with such talent.
Awesome. You're not on Twitter?
No, I never caught the Twitter bug.
I did for like a minute, like 5 years
It's a
ago.
hellscape. I don't.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I left ultimately, is it was really a cesspool. But of course, we're joking about this now that Elon Musk has bought it and is instituting
I'll
his
just
changes.
say I'm not paying to be verified. I occasionally, I mean, there are people I follow on it, but I literally cannot remember the last time I tweeted or retweeted. It's been a long time.
Okay. So I think that's it for this week. Until next time, as always, take care, take it easy, and stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by dreadpirateproductions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxham, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.